How does a man entrusted with the nation's highest office, a man sworn before millions to protect liberty and uphold the law, find himself complicit in a plot to unleash terror upon his own people? When Charles Logan first assumed the presidency, few saw him as a threat. He seemed hesitant, insecure, even weak, hardly the portrait of a ruthless villain. But beneath the veneer of uncertainty stirred quiet ambitions, a gnawing hunger to leave behind not just footprints but a legacy etched deeply in history. Step by step, compromise by careful compromise, Logan's ambition became his vulnerability, pulling him toward an unimaginable abyss. It began subtly, a whispered conversation behind closed doors, assurances that the nation's interests aligned perfectly with his own, advisors with quiet smiles and quiet words suggesting extraordinary means, off-the-record operations, secretive networks of private contractors, a pathway appearing to lead not to corruption but to greatness, a chance to rewrite his legacy in bold, decisive strokes. Yet each step down that path locked another door behind him. Decisions once framed as pragmatic began to curdle into something darker. Small justifications multiplied. Each secret made it harder to reverse course. Each lie became the foundation of the next. Until one day, Charles Logan awoke to find himself beyond morality, overseeing a nightmare he never consciously sought, covertly sanctioning the flow of nerve gas into the hands of terrorists, engineering a crisis meant to justify military intervention, all while telling himself it was for the greater good. But was Charles Logan inherently evil? Or was he, in a chilling way, disturbingly human, trapped within a system that slowly turned his fears and ambitions against him, reshaping his presidency, his morality, even his very self? This is Logan's story, told as he lived it, one incremental compromise at a time. Not as a caricature, not as a villainous cartoon, but as a leader who desperately wanted history's respect, who dreamt of uniting a fractured nation and securing peace abroad. Instead, he found himself spiraling toward infamy, ensnared by the hidden logic that power itself quietly imposes. Because Logan's downfall isn't merely about personal flaws. It's about how unchecked presidential authority reshapes the fabric of a government, quietly dismantling safeguards, silencing dissent, and redefining truths. It reveals a presidency that can become its own gravitational force, bending laws, institutions, and even reality itself around its center. By following the path Logan walked, through temptation, justification, and catastrophic collapse, we don't simply observe a fictional tragedy, we confront a haunting, real-world question. How do tiny breaches in integrity transform into existential threats to democracy? More urgently, what hidden vulnerabilities make a presidency susceptible to such a catastrophic spiral? And how do we recognize them before it's too late? Charles Logan had always felt overshadowed. Ascending to the presidency under uncertain circumstances, he sensed the public's whispered doubts, questions of legitimacy, competence, resolve. He'd spent nights staring at news cycles filled with criticism, replaying every misstep, every hesitation. His advisors murmured about weakness, and Logan, desperate to silence those voices, perhaps most of all his own, longed for a chance to rewrite his story. That chance arrived disguised as a landmark treaty, promising historic stability, a redefined legacy, and a presidency worth remembering. A treaty with a strategically crucial Central Asian nation appeared poised to become Logan's signature accomplishment. He imagined headlines declaring his diplomatic mastery, portraits of himself as a visionary leader whose decisive actions secured America's security, economic future, and global influence. But reality soon dimmed the dream. Negotiations stalled. Regional unrest threatened to derail everything. Logan saw his moment slipping away, and with it, the reputation he craved. It was at precisely this vulnerable juncture that figures like Christopher Henderson appeared, men who specialized in quiet, off-the-book solutions. They didn't speak of terrorism or explicit violence, not at first. Instead, their language was subtle, reassuring. They promised controlled chaos, strategic disruptions carefully calibrated to push reluctant parties to the table. In shadowed rooms and quiet corridors, Logan's ambition was gently reframed. What had once seemed morally impossible now appeared merely pragmatic, even wise. And Logan, driven by a consuming desire to be remembered not as indecisive but as a strong, decisive leader, listened closely. His advisors began to frame these covert maneuvers as tools of statecraft, simple necessities for national security, energy independence, and global stability. Carefully crafted briefings positioned the crisis as not just manageable, but desirable. A pressure point, a lever to finally move stubborn diplomats toward signing his legacy-defining treaty. Logan found himself nodding along, accepting the narrative that painted these informal, shadowy methods as justified and necessary, perhaps even inevitable. Yet even as Logan nodded, he chose not to see too clearly. Henderson spoke vaguely of private intelligence networks, off-books resources, and deniable intermediaries, terms that blurred accountability, presenting power without consequence. Logan heard no explicit mention of nerve gas or terrorists, just quiet assurances that outcomes could be controlled, actions contained. It was easier, perhaps essential, not to ask too many questions. Logan assured himself he was still firmly in control, even as he subtly opened doors he did not fully understand. In reality, he had just activated the hidden logic of catastrophe. At this moment, Logan had committed no explicit crime. Yet without fully grasping it, he'd already locked himself into a dangerous structural logic. His personal ambition, a profound yearning to rewrite his story as a decisive, historically meaningful leader, had fused seamlessly with a narrative of national interest, creating a powerful justification for action. This justification, now deeply internalized, authorized Logan to embrace covert methods, shadowy tools he scarcely comprehended, yet readily accepted. Each element justified the next in an endlessly reinforcing loop. Ambition framed the nation's need legitimized covert action, and covert action fed back into ambition, offering him an intoxicating illusion of control. In this closed cycle, the line between statesmanship and subversion blurred imperceptibly. Logan wasn't actively seeking betrayal. He had simply allowed the presidency's gravitational pull, his own unchecked ambition, to quietly reshape the moral universe around him, incrementally transforming impossible into inevitable. This triadic logic is the hidden engine beneath Logan's first steps toward tragedy. It reveals the unsettling truth that a presidency doesn't need explicit criminal intent to catalyze disaster, just the subtle alignment of ambition, justification, and available means. The trap was now set, though Charles Logan didn't yet sense how deeply he was caught. He still believed himself the measured leader, a president who simply chose to look away at precisely the right moment, trusting men like Christopher Henderson to handle the dark details. Logan told himself he had authorized nothing explicitly criminal, just measures necessary to protect the nation's interests, measures conveniently shielded by layers of deniability. The luxury of ignorance felt reassuringly close at hand, and so Logan began to subtly flex the immense discretionary powers granted to him as president, powers quietly embedded within the vast national security apparatus. He never gave direct orders to weaponize nerve gas, never explicitly directed contractors or black ops operatives to deliver weapons into terrorists' hands. Instead, he perfected the art of looking away, nodding at vague briefings, avoiding inconvenient clarifications, creating ambiguity through silence and indirect approval. Each quiet deflection signaled consent without explicit complicity, silently authorizing operations just beyond his view. Beneath the surface of government transparency, informal actors now thrived. Henderson's team moved swiftly, unburdened by formal oversight or institutional accountability. Private contractors handled sensitive cargo under plausible cover stories, while clandestine operators conducted meetings in anonymous safehouses far from the halls of power. Centok's nerve gas, horrifyingly lethal, yet labeled merely as strategic assets, began to quietly shift between shadowy hands. All of it carefully compartmentalized, sanitized from presidential awareness by the tacit agreement Logan himself had created. Inside government agencies, institutions designed precisely to prevent such abuses, alarms began softly ringing. CTU analysts stumbled upon fragmented intelligence that didn't add up. Procedures that should have halted covert operations were inexplicably circumvented. Official channels were increasingly silent or misleading, causing frustration, confusion, and growing suspicion among dedicated officers who found themselves cut off from the truth. No explicit laws were broken, yet operational integrity frayed beneath the weight of secrecy. The state's protective mechanisms became hollow shells empty of true authority. Still, Logan remained outwardly composed, protected by his carefully maintained ignorance. He told himself that he was simply letting capable people handle complex matters, trusting their discretion. But his own silence had become louder than any spoken command. Through passive approval, through willful ignorance, he had reshaped the machinery of government into two parallel worlds. One formal, visible, and reassuringly legal. The other hidden, untethered, volatile, and increasingly beyond anyone's real control. Though Logan didn't yet admit it to himself, his presidency had quietly transformed. His executive discretion, meant as a tool of responsible leadership, now formed the cornerstone of an emerging nightmare, one where secrecy masked criminality, plausible deniability shielded complicity, and power flowed invisibly, dangerously outside normal channels. This is the moment Logan's actions crossed a subtle yet decisive boundary, not into outright criminality but into something perhaps more dangerous: structural destabilization. The triad illuminates precisely how Logan's exercise of presidential discretion, his quiet nods, selective ignorance, and silent authorizations, activated informal channels operating without accountability or oversight. These shadowy operatives, empowered by Logan's ambiguous authority, quickly compromised the operational integrity of key institutions designed to ensure lawful, transparent governance. The logic here is deeply nonlinear. Without Logan's implicit approval, these informal channels would have remained dormant, contained, and harmless. But once he exercised discretion, once he silently consented, power immediately bypassed formal checks, creating two parallel governmental realities. Institutions that should have detected and corrected these abuses remained technically intact but became practically powerless, unable to identify or halt operations hidden in ambiguity. Logan may have believed he retained control, but the non-linear nature of his discretion, its quiet, indirect authority, had already destabilized the core of the system. He had unknowingly created conditions that allowed the presidency itself to become the vector for unchecked power, silently unraveling the very safeguards it was meant to uphold. By the time nerve gas crossed quietly into American territory, Charles Logan was no longer simply managing a diplomatic strategy or leveraging covert operations. He was orchestrating the survival of a presidency already compromised beyond recognition. In public, Logan still spoke passionately about threats abroad, his voice calibrated to convey solemn urgency, his demeanor carefully sculpted to project statesman-like resolve. But in private, Logan understood something dangerous. The real threat wasn't terrorism, it was exposure. As the crisis deepened, Logan began quietly dismantling the institutional safeguards around him. Intelligence shared with agencies like CTU became fragmented, manipulated, scrubbed of any trace linking the covert operations back to him. Dedicated analysts found themselves sifting through false leads, chasing mirages deliberately created to obscure the disturbing reality. Congressional committees received carefully curated briefings, withholding critical facts under the guise of national security. Each subtle distortion further isolated Logan's presidency from accountability. Yet, even amidst these careful manipulations, Logan faced a vulnerability he hadn't fully anticipated: David Palmer. Palmer was no ordinary private citizen. As a former president, he maintained the privilege of receiving classified security briefings. Like many retired senior officials in real life, Palmer's continuing access allowed him an unusual perspective. He could still glimpse the inner workings of the intelligence and national security machinery, even from outside the halls of power. While Palmer no longer held office, he remained deeply respected, influential, and, critically, able to piece together a puzzle Logan had carefully kept fragmented. Palmer's sharp mind, political instincts, and intimate familiarity with the presidency made him uniquely dangerous. Where others saw confusion, Palmer might recognize patterns. Where others found gaps, Palmer could sense cover-ups. The simple act of Palmer receiving briefings, examining incomplete intelligence through the eyes of an experienced statesman, threatened to expose everything Logan had painstakingly hidden. Unlike active officials who were tightly controlled through chains of command, Palmer's retired status gave him independence. He was free to speak, investigate, or even publicly challenge Logan without institutional reprisal. In response, Logan did something chillingly familiar to real-world tactics. He attempted to sever Palmer's access, contemplating the rescinding of his security clearance under a convenient national security pretext. Yet even Logan knew such a move would invite suspicion. Stripping Palmer's clearance would confirm Palmer's suspicions and reveal Logan's own desperation. Instead, Logan opted for a darker, more permanent solution. David Palmer was assassinated. It was a shocking, tragic act, but for Logan, a perversely logical one. Palmer's murder was not merely political violence, it represented the ultimate weaponization of secrecy, a final silencing of truth to maintain the illusion of integrity. This deliberate suppression of Palmer's access and eventual murder became a stark metaphor, echoing troubling real-world practices in which revoking security clearances is sometimes employed not for genuine security reasons, but to conceal wrongdoing or silence criticism. Security clearances, intended to ensure the safe flow of essential information, become dangerous when weaponized by authority figures seeking to evade accountability. In Logan's case, the attempt to revoke Palmer's clearance, and ultimately his life, was more than abuse of power. It represented an existential betrayal of democracy's basic requirement for transparency, accountability, and the open exchange of information. With Palmer gone, Logan's presidency slid rapidly into full opacity. Potential whistleblowers, agency insiders, career analysts, journalists quickly learned the price of dissent. Fear and paranoia began to pervade the halls of government. Individuals who might have spoken out fell silent, terrified by Palmer's fate. Institutions meant to maintain checks and balances became hollowed-out husks, quietly serving Logan's concealed agenda rather than national security. Logan had transformed his administration into something profoundly disturbing. A government where truth was malleable, accountability was non-existent, and security measures intended to safeguard democracy were instead exploited as tools of concealment and coercion. The triad vividly reveals the structural implications of Logan's descent into secrecy. As presidential accountability vanished behind walls of secrecy, the independence of institutions like CTU or congressional oversight committees simultaneously disintegrated, now unable to penetrate Logan's constructed falsehoods. At the same moment, the violent suppression of internal resistance and whistleblowing, epitomized by Palmer's assassination, completed the structural collapse. Each of these components was not simply weakened independently. Their failures reinforced and compounded one another in a relentless spiral of degradation. This reveals a disturbing systemic truth. A presidency committed to concealment does not merely weaken accountability, it actively dismantles every mechanism intended to constrain its power. Logan's efforts to silence Palmer illustrate how the dangerous erosion of transparency can extend far beyond administrative tactics like rescinding clearances. It can lead inexorably toward deeper forms of violence and suppression, turning democratic structures into authoritarian tools. Once accountability, institutional independence, and internal resistance all simultaneously collapse, democracy itself becomes structurally endangered, transformed into a self-sealing system of unchecked, unrestrained presidential authority. The moment Sentox nerve gas seeped into the public consciousness, released terrifyingly real in American streets, shopping malls, and hospitals, Charles Logan's presidency entered its terminal spiral. Any remaining illusion of control evaporated in an instant. From that point forward, Logan was no longer guiding events. He was chasing them desperately, locked in a cycle of damage control and escalating deception. The nightmare scenario he never explicitly ordered, yet tacitly authorized through layers of deniability, had finally unfolded. And now, there was no turning back. Inside the Oval Office, Logan experienced a sickening clarity. He couldn't stop the disaster without destroying himself. To acknowledge the nerve gas's true origins, U.S. resources covertly funneled into terrorists' hands, would collapse the presidency, shatter the nation's trust, and likely lead to impeachment, imprisonment, or worse. The psychological burden was crushing. Logan's presidency was built upon carefully crafted illusions, each rationalization leaning upon the next. To reverse course, to speak openly of what had been done, would mean confronting truths so horrifying that Logan himself could scarcely admit them, even privately. The presidency he had crafted was now his prison cell, locking him irrevocably into a path he never consciously chose but had quietly paved with every incremental deception. As panic spread across America, the administration's primary mission became the relentless management of narrative, an all-consuming effort far exceeding even the effort of containing the crisis itself. Official briefings given to the press twisted reality into a shape acceptable to Logan's continued survival. Diplomatic cables to foreign governments constructed delicate fictions to preserve a facade of competence. Internally, Logan's aides scrambled desperately to contain leaks, intercept CTU's inquiries, and disrupt investigative pathways. Every day required fresh lies, and each new lie needed others to sustain it, a cascading exponential proliferation of falsehood. Jack Bauer, relentless and resourceful, emerged as the ultimate threat, not because he endangered national security, but precisely because he pursued the truth Logan had so carefully buried. Logan's team, now fully immersed in the logic of deception, viewed Bauer's dogged pursuit of transparency as a mortal threat, something almost treasonous. To them, and to Logan himself, the truth was no longer a source of moral clarity, but a lethal virus capable of destroying everything they had constructed. Bauer was no longer a hero, not even an adversary. He was, in Logan's eyes, something existentially terrifying, the voice of accountability, knocking at the door of Logan's closed, compromised world. But beneath this frantic scramble, a deeper fracture was forming. Logan's presidency had ceased to possess true legitimacy, at home or abroad. His authority no longer derived from constitutional trust or public consent, but from desperate maintenance of appearances. He was ruling entirely by fiction. Yet the more elaborate and carefully sustained this fiction became, the more brittle it grew. Each additional cover-up, each suppression of evidence, each interference in CTU's investigation made legitimacy increasingly artificial, perilously fragile. Logan's administration existed now solely to maintain an appearance of integrity it no longer possessed. Each step in this direction required progressively more extreme measures to maintain, locking Logan into a permanent escalation that pulled him deeper into crisis with every passing hour. Charles Logan could feel his presidency collapsing, even as he was compelled to prop it up at any cost. He had long ceased to be in command. He had become a prisoner of his own manufactured reality, pushed inexorably forward by the structural demands of deception and survival. His presidency was now the victim and embodiment of the ultimate political paradox. The harder he struggled to sustain legitimacy, the more he destroyed it, and the more he destroyed it, the harder he had to fight. This final, devastating stage in Logan's presidency illustrates a harrowing structural truth. Logan wasn't merely trapped by circumstance or ideology, he was caught in a triadic feedback loop from which escape became impossible. At the heart of this loop was his inability to reverse course. Acknowledging the truth was morally unbearable and politically catastrophic. Because reversal was impossible, maintaining control over the narrative became his administration's overriding imperative. Every new act of deception and suppression required greater, more extreme acts of deception to sustain it, creating an ever-tightening spiral of dishonesty and fear. Yet narrative control alone could never suffice. It depended entirely upon maintaining the fragile illusion of legitimacy. Logan's legitimacy was no longer genuine. It was sustained solely by false narratives that obscured catastrophic truths. This legitimacy was brittle, fragile, increasingly hollow, constantly requiring fresh lies and escalating suppression to survive. The triad's logic reveals the deadly structural bind Logan created. Without legitimacy, narrative control collapses. Without narrative control, reversal becomes necessary and impossible. Without the willingness to reverse course, legitimacy further deteriorates. Each failure compounded the next, locking Logan permanently into escalation. His presidency now structured solely around deception. The more extreme his actions became, the narrower his choices grew, until finally Logan had no room left to maneuver, no reality left to defend, only the brutal, tragic momentum of a presidency spiraling toward inevitable collapse. You think this kind of thing can't happen? You think Logan was just a bad apple, a weak man who cracked under pressure? You're wrong. It doesn't start with villains. It starts with ambition, insecurity, a legacy to protect. It starts with a president staring down a tough call and convincing himself that one little compromise, one small secret, will save lives, that it's worth it, that no one needs to know. But I've been there. I've watched it happen, step by step. I've seen men turn their backs on everything they swore to protect, not because they wanted to betray the country, but because the system let them believe they still hadn't crossed the line. By the time they realized the truth, they were too far gone. If there's one thing the story of Charles Logan should teach us, it's this. Every abuse of power starts with silence, with a nod, with a classified order no one questions. It's never just one man, it's the structure that lets him operate in the dark. It's the people who look the other way. It's the ones who say, he's the president, he must know what he's doing. That's how democracies rot from the inside out. So stay alert, ask the hard questions, follow the truth, even when it's buried under 1,000 lies. Because once the system starts breaking, it won't fix itself. And when it comes down to it, no title, no office, no oath means a damn thing unless someone's willing to stand up and say this is where it stops.